By evening in 1927, somewhere in the ranch country of southern New Mexico, a wagon came rolling back along the fence line with nobody holding the reins. The boy who'd been driving sat frozen on the bench, staring at the empty seat beside him. The pastor who stepped off to pray hadn't climbed back up. The Bible lay open on the wagon seat, pages still warm under the boy's palm, though the desert air had already turned cold enough to sting bare skin. The sand around the barbed wire showed the pastor's boot prints walking out through the scrub grass, clear and deep, heel and toe pressed firm into the soft ground, but there were no prints coming back, and no mark in the dirt where a man might have stumbled or fallen or been dragged away. The circuit route ran through scattered cattle ranches east of the Rio Grande, where families lived 30 miles apart and saw a preacher maybe twice a year if the weather held, and the roads stayed passable. Pastor Amos Kern had been riding that territory since 1919, carrying a worn leather Bible with gilt edges rubbed smooth, and a wooden box full of letters from one ranch to the next, messages passed between families who had no other way to stay in touch. He was 52 years old that spring, a steady man with a lined face tanned dark from years under the sun, and hands scarred from carpentry work before he took up the circuit. People in New Mexico knew him as the kind who prayed long and quiet, who never raised his voice in anger or judgment, who could fix a wagon wheel or splice a broken harness, or deliver a sermon with the same calm attention to detail. His wife waited for him in a rented room above a dry goods store in Roswell, and every rider who passed through that part of the territory knew she counted the days between his trips home, marking them on a calendar tacked to the wall beside the window. On the afternoon of April 14th, Kern stopped the wagon at a lonely stretch of fence about 12 miles south of a trading post the ranchers called Cedar Crossing. There was no cedar anywhere near the place, just thorn scrub and dry pasture, running flat toward low hills the color of rust and iron. The boy driving for him that week was named Thomas Eckhart, 16 years old, hired on from a hardscrabble farm near Portales to help with the horses and the hauling and to keep the pasture company on the long stretches between ranches. Thomas said later, when people asked him to tell it again, that the pastor had been quiet most of the day, watching the sky like he was waiting for something to break loose. By 4 in the afternoon, the clouds were piling up dark and heavy over the western hills, thunder rumbling low enough to feel in the chest. But no rain had fallen in that country for 6 weeks straight, and the stock tanks were showing mud, and the cattle were getting lean. The pastor told the boy to stop the wagon. He climbed down slow, like a man whose knees hurt from too many hours on a hard bench, and he carried the Bible under one arm as he walked around to the fence line. Thomas watched him step careful through the barbed wire, holding the strands apart with one hand, and then kneel in the dirt just past the fence, maybe 20 feet from the road, with his back to the wagon. The boy heard the low murmur of prayer, though he couldn't make out the words over the wind starting to pick up through the scrub. The light was fading fast, the way it does in desert country when the sun drops below the hills and the temperature falls 10 degrees in as many minutes, and the air had that heavy stillness that comes before a storm that never arrives. Thomas looked down to check the near horse's harness, which had been rubbing a sore spot on the animal's shoulder. When he looked up again, maybe 30 seconds later, the pastor wasn't there. The patch of ground where he'd been kneeling was empty, no movement in the scrub, no dust rising, no sound of boots on gravel or cloth brushing through dry grass, just the fence wire humming soft in the wind, and the wagon creaking as the horses shifted their weight, uneasy. The boy called out. His voice cracked on the second try. No answer came back. He climbed down from the bench, his legs stiff from the long day's ride, and walked to the wire, gripping the Bible the pastor had left on the seat beside him. The pages were warm, as if someone had just been reading by lamplight for an hour, though there was no lamplit and the air was turning cold enough to make the boy pull his collar tight around his neck. He touched the top strand of wire and felt it vibrate under his palm, and then he stepped through, careful of the barbs that caught on wool if you weren't paying attention, and knelt where the pastor had knelt. The sand showed the shape of 2 knees pressed deep, and boot prints leading out from the road, heel and toe clear and sharp in the soft dirt, the kind of prints a man leaves when he's walking careful and slow. But there were no prints leading back toward the fence, none at all. The boy followed the tracks out into the scrub grass, counting steps under his breath the way his father had taught him to measure distance. They went 15 paces, then 20, then 23. And then they stopped, not faded, not smudged by wind or washed by rain that hadn't come. Just stopped, as if the man who made them had been lifted straight up into the failing light without so much as scuffing the dirt beneath his boots. Thomas walked a wide circle around the spot, looking for scuff marks, drag marks, blood on the thorn branches, torn cloth caught on wire, anything that might tell him which way the pastor had gone or what had happened to pull him away so fast. There was nothing but sand and scattered stones and the low scrub that grew in that dry country, tough and gray-green and smelling of creosote when the wind bent it sideways. He called again, louder this time, loud enough that his throat hurt and his voice carried out past the fence line into the empty pasture beyond. The wind picked up stronger, carrying the smell of dust and dried manure from the cattle pen somewhere miles to the north, and somewhere far off a coyote started its evening cry, the high yipping sound that makes a man feel alone, even when he's standing in the middle of a crowd. The boy stood there until the last light bled out of the sky and the stars started showing cold and white overhead, and then he climbed back through the fence, careful not to tear his shirt, and took up the reins with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He drove the wagon back to the nearest ranch, 5 miles north along a road he could barely see in the dark, trusting the horses to know the way. By the time he reached the Morrow place, it was full dark, the kind of dark you only get in open country when there's no moon, and the clouds are sitting low. He knocked on the door and told Ben Morrow and his wife what had happened, his voice shaking so bad he had to start over twice before they understood. Ben Morrow lit 2 lanterns and called his 2 grown sons down from the loft, and within 10 minutes they were saddled and riding out, the boy Thomas leading them back along the fence line with one of the lanterns balanced on his knee. They found the spot. They saw the boot prints going out clear in the lantern light and the smooth sand where nothing returned. They saw the knee marks still pressed into the dirt, sharp-edged as if the pastor had just stood up moments before, and one of the sons knelt and touched the sand and said it was still faintly warm, warmer than it should have been after the temperature had dropped so far. But there was no sign of the pastor in any direction, and the lantern light showed nothing moving in the scrub except jackrabbits freezing in the beam and the low scuttle of beetles dragging themselves across the cooling ground. They stayed until past midnight, calling his name in rotation so their voices wouldn't give out, walking slow grid patterns through the pasture with the lanterns held high, tying strips of white cloth torn from an old shirt to the fence posts to mark the places they'd already searched. The horses wouldn't go past a certain line about 40 yards from the road. They'd plant their hooves and back up hard, ears pinned flat against their skulls, snorting through their noses loud enough to hear over the wind. Ben Morrow's younger son tried to push his mount forward past that invisible line, and the animal reared so sharp the boy nearly went off backward into the wire, and after that nobody tried to force them any farther. When they rode back to the ranch that night, nobody spoke much. The boy Thomas sat on the porch with the Bible still clutched tight against his chest, the leather warm under his hands even though the night air had turned cold enough to frost, and one of the women brought him coffee in a tin cup he let go cold without drinking. Ben Morrow stood by the corral gate, rolling a cigarette with hands that wouldn't stay steady, striking 3 matches before one caught, and finally he said what everybody standing there was thinking but didn't want to say out loud. Ground out there don't give back what it takes. People in New Mexico still tell that story, quiet, when the subject comes up. And after that night in April 1927, nobody rode those fence lines alone before dusk, and the older hands started warning the younger ones that if you hear someone praying out past the wire after the light fails, you turn your horse around and you ride straight home without looking back. By sunrise the next morning, men from 3 other ranches had ridden into the Morrow place, and by 7 o'clock there were 14 of them gathered in the yard, checking saddles and filling canteens and listening while Thomas Eckhart told the story one more time. They wanted the timeline exact. The pastor had stopped the wagon at 4 in the afternoon, maybe a few minutes after. Thomas had looked away to check the harness. 30 seconds, maybe 40. When he looked back, the man was gone. No sound, no struggle, just gone. One of the riders, a man named Carl Dowd who'd worked cattle in New Mexico since before it was a state, asked the boy if he'd heard anything strange in the hours before they stopped. Thomas thought about it, then nodded slow. He said that around noon, when they were passing through a draw about 6 miles north of where the pastor disappeared, he'd heard a low whistle, 2 notes, short and sharp, coming from somewhere off to the east. He'd asked the pastor if he heard it, and the pastor had gone quiet for a long time before saying it was probably just a ranch hand calling in horses. But there were no horses in that draw, and no ranch for miles in that direction. The men looked at each other. Carl Dowd rolled a cigarette and didn't light it, just held it between his fingers and stared at the ground. "Two-note whistle," he said, quiet. "My father used to say that sound don't belong to any man working this country." They rode out in a line, spread wide enough that each man could see the one next to him, walking their horses slow through the scrub. They started at the fence where the pastor had knelt and worked outward in widening circles, checking every hollow and dry wash, every patch of ground soft enough to hold a print. The sky was clear and hard, the kind of blue that makes your eyes ache if you look at it too long, and the wind had died down to nothing, so every sound carried: the creak of saddle leather, the clink of bit chains, the low huffing breath of the horses as they picked their way through the thorn scrub. By mid-morning, they'd covered a square mile and found nothing. No trace of the pastor. No torn cloth. No blood. No sign he'd been dragged or carried. The boot prints were still there, leading out from the fence and stopping in open ground, and now, in full daylight, they could all see what Carl Dowd had seen the night before. The sand around the last print was smoothed in long, sweeping arcs, as if something had brushed it flat while moving backward toward the road. But there were no marks to show what had done the brushing. Just smooth sand, faintly rippled, like water that had settled after something passed through. They tied strips of white cloth to the fence posts every 20 yards to mark the search grid, and one of the younger men, a hand from the Petrie Ranch named Lonnie Voss, climbed up on the wagon and counted the strips to make sure they had the area covered. While he was standing there, he saw something that made him go still. He called down to Carl Dowd and pointed. There was a strip of cloth tied to a post about 40 yards south of the road, near the spot where the horses had refused to go the night before. But nobody remembered tying cloth that far out. Carl rode over and looked at it. The cloth was white, same as the others, but it was tied in a different knot, a kind of slip knot that none of the men used. He touched it and pulled his hand back fast. "Still warm," he said. His voice was flat, like a man trying not to show he's rattled. "Cloth's been sitting in the sun, maybe, but it feels like it was just tied." One of the Morrow sons rode up beside him and reached out to touch it too, then thought better of it and let his hand drop. "Nobody rode out this far," he said. "We've all been in sight of each other since we started." They left the cloth where it was and kept searching. By noon, the temperature had climbed into the 80s and the men were sweating through their shirts, but nobody suggested stopping for water or shade. They worked the grid slow and methodical, covering every foot of ground twice, checking under the thorn scrub and along the edges of the dry washes where a man might have crawled if he was hurt or confused. They found nothing. Just sand and stone, and the low gray-green scrub that grew in that country, and the silence pressing in from all sides. Around 1 in the afternoon, one of the men called out. He was kneeling by a clump of scrub about 60 yards from the fence line, near the edge of the search area. The others rode over and dismounted. He pointed to the ground. There was a single boot print there, clear and fresh, pressed deep into the soft sand. It matched the prints leading out from the fence, same size, same tread. But it was facing the wrong direction. The toe was pointed back toward the road, as if the pastor had turned around and started walking back, but there were no other prints near it. Just that one print, alone, in the middle of empty ground. Carl Dowd knelt beside it and studied it for a long time without touching it. Finally, he stood up and looked at the others. "That don't make sense," he said. "If he walked back, there'd be more prints. If he was dragged, there'd be drag marks. This is just one print clean, like he stepped here and then vanished all over again." They stood there in the heat, none of them saying what they were all thinking. One of the younger hands, a boy not much older than Thomas, asked if maybe an animal could have made it, a coyote or a dog walking in the pastor's old tracks. Carl shook his head. "Wrong size, wrong depth. That's a man's boot, and it's fresh. Sand hasn't started to collapse in on itself yet." They marked the spot with another strip of cloth and kept working. By 3 in the afternoon, they'd covered 2 square miles and still found nothing that made sense. The single boot print, the tied cloth that nobody remembered tying. the smoothed sand around the last print near the fence. And through it all, the memory of that two-note whistle the boy had heard at noon the day before, coming from a direction where no ranch hand had any reason to be. That evening, back at the Morrow place, the men gathered in the yard and tried to put together what they knew. Pastor Kern had been seen at the Harlan Ranch the morning of April 14th, saying a prayer for a sick child and leaving a letter for the family to send north. He'd been calm, steady, same as always. He and the boy had taken the wagon south around 11, heading for the next ranch on the circuit, 15 miles down the road. They'd stopped at the fence line at 4. The boy had looked away for 30 seconds. The pastor was gone. One of the men asked if the pastor had any enemies. Ben Morrow shook his head. "Man didn't have an enemy in this territory," he said. "He was the kind you trusted with your children and your money and your secrets. If someone wanted him gone, they'd have had to come from outside, and there's been no strangers through here in weeks." Another man, older, with a face like tanned leather, said quiet, "Maybe it wasn't a man that took him." Nobody answered that. They stood there in the cooling air, watching the light fade over the hills, and one by one they drifted toward their horses. Before they left, Carl Dowd pulled Ben Morrow aside and said something the others didn't hear, but later that night Ben told his sons what it was. Carl had said that the older hands in New Mexico used to tell a story about certain stretches of ground that didn't follow the rules men understood, places where the land had a say in who crossed it and who didn't come back. He said that fence line had always felt wrong to him, even before this, and now he wouldn't ride it alone for any reason, day or night. The next morning they brought in dogs, 3 hounds borrowed from a rancher who used them for tracking cattle thieves. The dogs picked up the scent from the pastor's coat, which Thomas had brought in the wagon, and they ran straight to the fence line, noses down, pulling hard on the leads. They followed the boot prints out into the scrub, baying loud, and then, about 15 yards from the road, they stopped. All 3 of them at once. They didn't slow down or get confused. They just stopped, planted their legs, and started whining high and thin, the way a dog sounds when it's hurt or scared. The man holding the leads tried to pull them forward. They dug in and wouldn't move. One of them lay down flat and pressed its belly to the sand, shaking. They tried again from a different angle, starting the dogs farther south and letting them work their way north toward the spot. Same result. The dogs ran eager until they got within 20 yards of where the boot prints stopped, and then they froze, whining, ears back, tails tucked. One of them turned and tried to bolt back toward the wagons, dragging its handler sideways through the scrub. Carl Dowd watched this and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Dogs know something we don't." They gave up on the dogs and went back to the grid search, working farther out now, checking draws and washes up to 3 miles from the fence line. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign the pastor had walked or crawled or been carried in any direction. By the 3rd day, men were starting to leave, riding back to their ranches to handle work that couldn't wait. Ben Morrow and his sons stayed, along with Carl Dowd and a handful of others. But even they were running out of places to look. On the evening of the 3rd day, just before sunset, one of the Morrow sons was riding the fence line, checking the cloth strips they'd tied to mark the search area. He found something that made him pull up short. There was a strip of cloth tied to a post near the road, about 10 yards north of where the pastor had knelt. It was the same white cloth they'd been using, torn from the same shirt, but it was tied in a slip knot, the same strange knot they'd found on the cloth 40 yards south 3 days before. And when he touched it, he pulled his hand back fast. It was warm, not sun warm, warm like something alive had just been holding it. He rode back to the ranch without checking the rest of the line, and that night he told his father he wasn't going back out there, not for any reason, not even in daylight with 10 men riding beside him. His father didn't argue. By the end of the 1st week, the search had turned into something else, something that felt less like rescue and more like ritual. Men rode out every morning at first light, checking the same ground they'd checked the day before, walking the fence line in pairs, never alone, tying fresh strips of cloth to the posts to replace the ones that had gone missing or been moved. Nobody said out loud that the cloth strips were disappearing, but everyone had noticed. You'd tie a strip to a post in the morning, ride past it at noon, and by evening it would be gone, or moved 3 posts down, or tied in that strange slip knot that nobody claimed to know how to make. The women from the nearby ranches started bringing food to the Morrow place every evening. Hot stew and cornbread and coffee that the men drank standing up in the yard, too tired to sit, but too restless to go home. The pastor's wife arrived from Roswell on the 8th day, riding in a wagon with a neighbor who'd offered to bring her. She was a small woman, gray-haired, with a face that looked like it had cried itself dry days before. She asked to see the spot where her husband had disappeared, and Ben Morrow took her there in the wagon, with his wife sitting beside her and Thomas Eckhart driving, the same boy who'd been there when it happened. She stood by the fence for a long time, not speaking, just looking out at the empty scrub. Then she asked to see the Bible. Thomas brought it from the wagon, still wrapped in the cloth he'd been keeping it in, and handed it to her careful, like it might break. She opened it to the page that had been left open, Psalm 102, and ran her fingers over the words. "He marked this page," she said, quiet. "See the corner folded down? That's how he kept his place when he was preparing a sermon." But when she looked closer, her face changed. She turned the Bible toward the light and pointed to something written in the margin, small pencil marks in handwriting she recognized. It was a single line, written neat along the edge of the page. "Check the fence line south." Ben Morrow leaned in to look. "Was that there before?" he asked. She shook her head, slow. "I don't know. He wrote in the margins sometimes when he was studying, but I don't remember seeing this." She looked at Thomas. "Did you see him write anything that day?" The boy shook his head. "He didn't have a pencil out, he just carried the Bible under his arm when he got down from the wagon." One of the other men, Carl Dowd, took the Bible and held it up to the sun, squinting at the pencil marks. "Looks fresh," he said. "Graphite hasn't smudged. If this was written weeks ago, there'd be finger marks all over it from turning pages." He looked at the pastor's wife. "You sure you don't remember him writing this?" She stared at the page for a long time, then closed the Bible and held it against her chest. "I'm not sure of anything anymore," she said. They took her back to the ranch and she stayed there 3 days, waiting for news that didn't come. On the second day, she asked to go through the wooden box of letters the pastor had been carrying, the messages he'd been delivering from ranch to ranch. The box was still in the wagon, untouched since the disappearance. She opened it and started sorting through the envelopes, reading the names on the outside, checking them against a list she kept in a small notebook. Everything was in order, every letter accounted for, except one. At the bottom of the box, folded in half and tucked under the others, was a piece of paper that didn't belong. It was a page torn from a ledger, the kind churches use to track attendance and offerings, with ruled lines and columns for names and dates. The handwriting on it was the pastor's, she was certain of that, but the date written at the top made her go cold. April 16th, 1927, 2 days after he disappeared. The entry was short, just a few lines written in the attendance column. Service held at fence line. No congregation present. Prayed for rain. Rain did not come. Ground has other needs. She showed it to Ben Morrow and he called the other men in from the yard. They stood around the kitchen table staring at the page, nobody wanting to touch it. Carl Dowd finally picked it up and held it to the light, checking the paper, the ink, the pressure of the handwriting. "This is his hand," he said. "I've seen his writing enough times to know. But if this was written on the 16th, he wrote it 2 days after he vanished." One of the younger men, Lonnie Voss, said what they were all thinking. Maybe he wrote it before and just put the wrong date. Carl shook his head. Man who keeps a circuit route like he did doesn't put the wrong date on a ledger. He'd be more careful about that than about anything else. Dates are how he tracked where he'd been and where he was going next. The pastor's wife sat down at the table and put her face in her hands. "He's not coming back," she said quiet. "I know that now. Whatever happened out there, he's not coming back." Nobody argued with her. They'd all known it for days, but hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Ben Morrow's wife put a hand on her shoulder and said something soft, too low for the men to hear, and after a while the pastor's wife stood up and asked to be taken back to Roswell. She left the next morning, taking the Bible and the wooden box with her. But she left the ledger page on the table. She said she didn't want it in her house. The men kept searching, but the heart had gone out of it. They were going through the motions now, checking ground they'd already checked a dozen times, knowing they wouldn't find anything but unable to stop looking. On the 10th day, Carl Dowd found something that made him call the others over. He was walking the fence line south of where the pastor had knelt, about 100 yards down, checking the posts for more of those cloth strips that kept appearing and disappearing. He found a strip tied to a post in that same slipknot, still warm to the touch, and beside it, lying in the sand at the base of the post, was a second Bible. It was the same size as the pastor's, same worn leather cover, same gilt edges rubbed smooth. Carl picked it up careful, using the tail of his shirt so he wouldn't touch it with his bare hands, and opened it. The inside cover had a name written in faded ink. Amos Kern, 1919. The same name. The same year he'd started riding the circuit. But the pastor's wife had taken his Bible with her when she left. This was a second copy, identical, lying in the sand where it shouldn't exist. Carl carried it back to the ranch and showed it to Ben Morrow and the others. They opened it to Psalm 102, the same page that had been left open in the original Bible, and found the corner folded down in the same place. But there was no pencil mark in the margin, no note about checking the fence line. Just the printed text, clean and unmarked. One of the men said, quiet, "How many Bibles did he carry?" Nobody knew. Nobody wanted to guess. They wrapped the second Bible in cloth and put it in the barn, and after that day, nobody wanted to go near it. Word started spreading through the ranches, the way news travels in country where people live far apart but talk whenever they meet. The story changed depending on who told it, but the core stayed the same. Pastor Kern had stepped off a wagon to pray and vanished. The ground showed his tracks going out but not coming back. His Bible had been warm hours after he disappeared. A note in his handwriting had appeared with a date after he was gone. A second Bible identical to the first had been found lying in the sand 100 yards from where he'd knelt. Some said he'd had enemies, men who didn't like his preaching or his politics, though nobody could name who those men might be. Others said the land out past that fence line had always been strange, that cattle wouldn't graze there even when the pasture was green, that horses shied away from it for no reason anyone could see. A few whispered it wasn't a man at all that brought the herd home that evening, that something had walked back through that fence wearing the pastor's shape and left his Bible on the seat to make people think he'd just stepped away for a moment. But nobody in New Mexico said that last part out loud, not where others could hear. It was the kind of thing you thought about late at night, lying awake, listening to the wind rattle the windows and wondering what sounds were just wind and what sounds were something else. The older hands started warning the younger ones. Don't ride that fence line alone. Don't stop your horse if you hear a 2-note whistle coming from the scrub. Don't answer if you hear someone praying out past the wire after dark. And if you find a strip of white cloth tied in a slip knot on a post you know was empty yesterday, don't touch it. Just mark the spot in your mind and ride away. By the end of April, the search had stopped. There was nowhere left to look that hadn't been looked at a dozen times, and the men had work waiting back at their own places, calving season coming on and fences that needed mending. Ben Morrow and his sons rode out one last time, pulled down all the cloth strips they could find and stacked them in a pile by the fence. By the next morning, the pile was gone. The cloth strips were back on the posts, tied in slip knots, still faintly warm in the cool dawn air. After that, nobody tried to take them down again. By May of 1927, the fence line south of Cedar Crossing had been marked off with warning posts, 2 wooden stakes driven into the ground on either side of the road with wires strung between them. No official sign, no written explanation. Just wire across the road at chest height, the kind of barrier that says don't go past here without needing words. Riders coming through that country for the first time would pull up at the wire, look at the empty pasture beyond, and ask what they were supposed to be avoiding. The locals would tell them, if they asked direct, but most of the time they'd just say, the ground past that fence didn't belong to any ranch anymore, and it was better to ride around. Ben Morrow and his sons stopped running cattle in that section. They had plenty of pasture to the north and east, and there was no reason to push livestock through ground that spooked horses, and made dogs lie down whimpering. By the end of summer, they'd moved the fence line back, abandoning a full quarter-mile of grazing land and letting it go to scrub. Nobody questioned the decision. The other ranchers did the same over the next few years, pulling their fences in, ceding ground to whatever it was that lived out there past the wire. The pastor's wife never came back to New Mexico. She stayed in Roswell for another month, settling her husband's affairs and packing up the rented room above the dry goods store, and then she moved back east to live with family in Missouri. Before she left, she donated the wooden box of letters to the church in Roswell, but she kept the Bible. Years later, after she died, her daughter found it wrapped in cloth at the bottom of a cedar chest. The daughter opened it to Psalm 102 and saw the pencil mark in the margin, the note about checking the fence line south. And she remembered her mother saying once, late at night when she thought no one was listening, that some things shouldn't be written down because writing them makes them more real than they already are. The second Bible, the one Carl Dowd found lying in the sand, stayed in Ben Morrow's barn for 3 years, wrapped in cloth and tucked in a corner where nobody had reason to go. In 1930, during a hard winter when the wind was coming down cold from the north and the stock tanks were freezing over every night, one of the Morrow sons went into the barn to check on a sick calf. He found the Bible lying open on a hay bale, pages warm to the touch even though the barn was cold enough to see your breath. He backed out slow, not touching it, and told his father. Ben Morrow went in with a lantern and found the Bible closed again, wrapped tight in the cloth just as they'd left it, cold as everything else in the barn. After that, they burned it. They took it out into the yard, poured lamp oil over it, and set it on fire. The leather cover curled and blackened and the pages turned to ash, and they buried the ash in a hole dug 6 feet deep behind the barn. The next morning, one of the ranch hands found a strip of white cloth tied to the fence post nearest the house, tied in a slipknot still faintly warm in the freezing dawn air. Nobody touched it. It stayed there for weeks, flapping in the wind, until one morning it was gone and nobody asked where. By 1935, the story had spread far enough that people in Roswell and Portales knew not to take the road south of Cedar Crossing after dark, and even during the day most riders preferred to go the long way around. The few who still used that stretch rode in pairs, never alone, and they didn't stop for any reason between the 2 warning posts that marked the bad ground. If you had a flat tire or a loose saddle or a horse throwing a shoe, you kept going until you were clear, and you fixed it on the other side where the ground felt normal again. The old hands told the younger ones, you don't stop if you hear a whistle. You don't answer if you hear someone praying. You don't touch the cloth strips if you find them tied to the posts. And you never, for any reason, step through that fence after the light starts to fail. The stories grew with the telling the way stories do, but the core stayed the same. A man had knelt to pray and vanished. The ground showed his tracks going out but none coming back. His Bible had been warm hours after he disappeared, and a second Bible had appeared where it shouldn't exist, and a note in his handwriting had been found dated 2 days after he was gone. In 1942, a young schoolteacher moved to one of the ranches east of Cedar Crossing to teach the children of 3 families who lived too far from town to make the daily trip. Her name was Margaret Sills, and she'd grown up in Albuquerque and didn't know the old stories. On her 3rd day there, she asked if she could take the wagon south to visit a family she'd heard lived down that way. The woman of the house, one of Ben Morrow's daughters-in-law, told her no, told her flat and firm that the road south wasn't used anymore and hadn't been for years. The teacher asked why. The woman looked at her for a long time, then said, because people who go down that road alone don't always come back the same, and some don't come back at all. The teacher didn't ask again, but a week later, while she was walking with the children near the fence line during a lesson about local plants, one of the boys, 8 years old, stopped and pointed at a strip of white cloth tied to a post about 50 yards away. That's one of the markers, he said. My grandfather says we're not supposed to go near them. Margaret asked what the markers were for. The boy looked at her like she'd asked why the sky was blue. So we know where not to go, he said. There's a man still praying out there, and if you get too close, you might not come back. She asked the other children if they knew the story. They all did. Every one of them. Some of their parents had been part of the search party in 1927, 15 years before, and they'd all grown up hearing the rules. Don't go past the markers. Don't stop if you hear a whistle. Don't answer if you hear someone praying. These were rules as fixed as not touching fire or not drinking from the stock tank. The children didn't question them any more than they questioned which way the sun rose. By 1950, most of the families who remembered Pastor Kern firsthand had moved away or passed on, but the rules stayed. New families moving into the area learned them within the first week, taught by neighbors who didn't explain much but made it clear the rules weren't negotiable. The fence line south of Cedar Crossing was still avoided. The cloth strips still appeared on the posts, tied in slip knots, warm to the touch for a few hours and then cold again. And every few years, someone passing through that country at dusk would report hearing a low murmur of prayer coming from the empty scrub, though when they stopped to listen, the sound would fade and they'd ride on fast without looking back. In 1954, a surveyor from Santa Fe came through to map property lines for the county. He was working alone, walking the fence lines with a transit and a notebook, marking posts and measuring distances. When he reached the section south of Cedar Crossing, he found the old warning posts still standing, the wire strung between them rusted and sagging. He stepped over it and kept working. By the time the sun started to drop, he'd covered a quarter-mile of fence line and was packing up his equipment when he noticed something lying in the sand near one of the posts. It was a Bible, leather cover worn smooth, gilt edges rubbed down to nothing. He picked it up and opened it. The inside cover had a name, Amos Kern, 1919. He brought it back to the ranch where he was staying and asked if anyone knew who Amos Kern was. The rancher's wife went pale. She asked where he'd found it. He told her. She took the Bible from his hands, wrapped it in a dish towel without opening it, and put it in a wooden box in the back of a closet. She told the surveyor he was welcome to stay the night, but he needed to be gone by morning, and he wasn't to go back to that fence line for any reason. He left before dawn and filed his survey report with a note that the southern section couldn't be accurately measured due to terrain difficulties. He never came back to that part of New Mexico again. The Bible stayed in the closet for 2 years. The rancher's wife wouldn't touch it and wouldn't let anyone else touch it either. Finally, in 1956, a priest from Roswell came through on a circuit of his own, checking on the Catholic families scattered through the ranch country. The woman asked him to take the Bible and dispose of it properly, whatever that meant. He agreed. He wrapped it in a canvas sack, blessed it, and took it back to Roswell, where he locked it in a cabinet in the church office. A year later, a fire gutted the church. The cabinet survived, but when they opened it, the Bible was gone, just ash in the shape of a book, still warm to the touch 3 days after the fire was put out. People in New Mexico still don't talk much about what happened to Pastor Amos Kern in the spring of 1927. If you ask direct, you'll get different answers depending on who's telling it. Some say he had enemies, men who didn't like his preaching and followed him out to that fence line and killed him and buried him where he'd never be found. But nobody can name the enemies, and no grudges were ever known against him in that country. Some say he got confused in the heat, wandered off into the scrub, and collapsed in a draw where the search parties didn't look deep enough. But the dogs couldn't find him, and the ground was checked for miles in every direction, and his tracks led out into open space with nowhere to hide. And some say the ground out past that fence line doesn't follow rules the way other ground does, that it has needs men don't understand, and that when it takes something, it doesn't give it back in any way that makes sense. They say Pastor Kern knelt to pray for rain in a place that didn't want rain, that wanted something else, and when he finished praying, the ground answered in its own way. They don't say what it answered. They just say the Bible was warm for hours after he was gone, and a second Bible appeared where it shouldn't, and a note was written in his handwriting 2 days after he vanished. And those things don't happen in a world where the rules stay fixed. Nobody in New Mexico rides that stretch of road alone anymore. Not now, not for 70 years. The warning posts are gone, rotted into the ground and replaced by nothing. But the locals still know where the line is, and they still teach their children not to cross it. And every few years, someone passing through at dusk will hear a low murmur of prayer coming from the empty scrub, and they'll stop their truck or their horse and listen. And for just a moment they'll feel the air turn warm around them, warm like breath, warm like pages held too long in human hands. And then the warmth will fade, and they'll drive on, And they won't talk about it afterward because talking about it makes you think too hard about which version of the story you actually believe. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in New Mexico dares to say out loud? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.